Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. We are just going to wait a couple more minutes before kicking off so that folks can filter in. Thanks for your patience. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started here. I think a few more people are filtering in, but most people seem to be here. So welcome to our plenary working group session. We've been really busy over the last couple of weeks and have really enjoyed meeting with you in separate topical groups and digging into the model. My name's Edith Bayer. I'm team lead here at the Oregon Department of Energy on the energy policy team and leading up the work on the energy strategy. And I just want to cover a couple of slides to kick us off. Mary, if you can go to the next slide, please. The first one is the obligatory WebEx slide. You might notice that a lot of you noticed, I'm sure, and received an email today with a new link. And I just wanted to explain that we reflected on this meeting and how many people are in the meeting. That we're expecting up to around 120 people since we're bringing all the working groups back together. And we want to make sure that we can maximize everybody's ability to ask questions and for us to answer those really efficiently. And so what we've done is included you as participants. And so rather than taking raised hands and spoken questions, we'll ask you throughout this meeting to put your question in the chat. And behind the scenes, we're going to be working to pull those questions together and to be ready to go through them at the end of the meeting. And we have about a half hour at the end of the meeting. And in the middle, we have another window where we'll be taking those questions. So we are leaving time for questions. We're just doing it a little bit differently than we did it in the smaller breakout groups. So this is kind of the interface. I think you all are probably used to it by now. And we've highlighted here the chat so that you know where you can submit your questions. If we go to the next slide, please. We want to remind everybody just to do a little bit of ground setting here that we recognize we're all coming from a different place and everybody's views are really important. And it's really important to listen, to share, to seek to have a constructive dialogue. So we really want to encourage everyone to listen carefully. That means really seeking to understand each other's perspectives, keep an open mind, ask questions in the chat to clarify and understand the information, be respectful of other questions that have been asked, and create space for everybody to have a chance to ask questions as well. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the goals of today's meeting. We have about 2 hours, and we have a few objectives that we want to realize. One is we just want everybody from all of the working groups to hear what we talked about in the other working groups. There's a lot of topical overlap, and so it's really important to provide that opportunity for you all to get a kind of a big picture idea of how all the pieces are fitting together. Along those lines, we also have been working really hard behind the scenes to synthesize everything that we've heard and look through some of the materials that have been shared. And we're going to present a first draft of a reference scenario with you today. And we're going to be highlighting in kind of bolded orange text, so you can't miss it now or afterwards when you review the slides, where we've made some proposed changes to what our starting point was based on what we've heard, and also where we're really seeking your feedback. And we'll provide an overview as well of the what if questions that we've heard so far, the sorts of questions that would feed into alternative scenarios. Again, also to help ground everybody in what's been discussed across the different working groups and what sorts of themes are emerging from those conversations. And I would say the biggest objective really is to enable you to submit written comments on the reference scenario by August 31st to us at the Oregon Department of Energy. We have an online portal. We have a link in the presentation to it. Somebody might throw it here into the chat as well. And so what our presentation focuses on, what we're highlighting, and what we ask you to consider as you're formulating questions is to share with us whether there are any clarifying questions that you need answered to be able to go back through and send us some written comments. And we'd like you to consider in your comments whether we've missed anything important, whether the draft reference scenario captures what you expected to see, and if not, why not? And we're also interested in additional what if questions that you'd like to share. Maybe you want to elaborate or shift the focus of the types of questions that you've shared with us before. Once we have a reference scenario, then it's easier to see what those what if questions might be and what in the vision that might have been shared in the working groups is actually embedded in that reference scenario. So you can see Jessica up here on the screen. So she and I are going to be running through your comments and questions from the chat at the end of in the last portion of the meeting. So if we go to the next slide, just wanted to share a little bit of kind of a reminder of oh, sorry, I forgot we have agenda here. Okay, so agenda for today. This is just a brief overview leading into the presentation by each of the working group leads on the highlights from each working group and elements of the draft reference scenario that where we've changed something and where we're interested in your feedback. Then we'll have Jeremy Hargreaves from Evolved Energy Research, part of the CETI team, present the draft reference scenario and share the biggest assumptions that we are putting in there, the sort of heaviest hitting assumptions that frame up what that draft reference scenario is going to look like. And we'll have some time in that window as well to take questions, and Jeremy will be here to answer those questions just after he's presented. Then I'll give a brief overview of those what if questions, as I just mentioned, and then we're going to turn to reviewing questions from the chat. So that's the structure of our meeting. We have 2 hours until 3 p.m. Pacific. And if we go to the next slide, I just want to ground us a little bit in where we are in the process, particularly because there are a couple of minor changes that we've made to how we're approaching this. So we really appreciate everyone's willingness to jump in and to participate in the working groups and in today's meeting. We know that it's been a tight timeline and that this is a complicated model and a complicated project. So you can see here an overview of the meetings that we've had throughout August leading up to our meeting today. And then we'll have next Monday a meeting of the interagency steering group. So we'll be having a similar conversation with sister agencies. And then on September 9th, we'll be presenting an updated proposed modeling approach and scenarios to the advisory group. Before September 9th, we have that August 31st deadline. I just want to emphasize that that's the deadline for comments on the reference scenario. We're very happy to receive your comments on alternative scenarios too, particularly since your thinking might change based on how the reference is being structured. That's really important because between August 31st and September 9th, we'll be taking into account those comments to potentially revise the draft scenario that we're presenting today and come up with an updated version. And I'll just add that we will also be preparing a draft of the alternative scenarios. We're not there yet, and we've just realized with the timeline being as tight as it is, that it would be beneficial to focus everybody on just the reference right now, and we'll follow up shortly after this meeting with a timeline for comments on the alternative scenarios. So we're building a little bit more time into the process for that piece of it. And on September 24th, we'll have a public webinar to present the modeling approach, also incorporating anything we heard in that September 9th meeting. We'll present the reference scenario, and potentially, if we've gotten there by then, we may be in shape to present the alternative scenarios. If we go to the next slide, this is just a kind of a graphic depiction of what we've been doing essentially in that timeline. So we have all of these different groups and meetings working throughout, particularly the month of August, to understand the model and to ask questions and to provide us feedback on the model and the modeling approach. We've taken that data and synthesized it, and we've developed this draft reference scenario that we'll be presenting to you today. We have been working really hard on data sources. We're using publicly available data sources, often national data sources, but we've been working really hard to make sure that we are applying regional data sets wherever available so that the study really focuses on Oregon-specific and region-specific data. And we've also been working to develop the final assumptions for the reference scenario. If we go to the next slide, this is the process from today. So today we're starting we're starting this process of showing the draft reference scenario, working through it with you, with the steering group. The steering group is the interagency group. With the advisory group, we'll be collecting public comments. We have that August 31st deadline. We'll work to make final changes and to present a final reference scenario in that end of September webinar. If we go to the next slide, I wanted to just also share a reminder of the some of the criteria that are guiding how we're making decisions and evaluating the inputs into the analysis and how the analysis itself is working. So this slide shows that the criteria fall into two groups. We have constraints that are built into the model and additional considerations. The model constraints are fundamental to the energy strategy, such as the model must enable the state to meet its energy policy objectives like HB 2021 and the Climate Protection Program. It must also model a reliable energy system. In other words, the model can't solve for an electricity resource mix and a broader energy resource mix that doesn't meet reliability requirements, that doesn't meet demand. And finally, the model inputs must include existing policy, so they can build on policy, because we don't necessarily have policies covering everything between now and 2050, but it can't model things that aren't currently allowed. And some other considerations include just making sure that we're using the best available data, transparent data, and quality data throughout the analysis. And we're modeling input to inform near-term decisions, but taking into account the longer-term implications of those decisions and learning from what those longer-term implications are to inform near-term policy decisions. If we go to the next slide, I think it's important to just pause on what the analysis does and doesn't do. So firstly, the analysis does what the bill asks us to do, which is to develop pathways to meeting our energy policy objectives and understanding the trade-offs of different pathways. These policies cut across electricity, transportation, and direct use fuels, the whole economy. And the model integrates electricity sector and fuel supply for an economy-wide perspective. The reference case sets feasible but aggressive demand side inputs for efficiency, electrification, and flexibility. Those are all inputs. that we've discussed in our working groups. And this is a little different from what you might be used to in the IRP world. We're also creating complementary analysis to look at co-benefits and costs of different pathways on equity, on environmental justice, on land use, jobs, and air quality and health. What the model does not do, it does not serve the same purpose as utility integrated resource plan models. It's not a least cost planning tool. It's a mechanism to understand economy-wide decarbonization options and their implications to inform policy. Along these lines, the model does not focus on any single utility service territory. It's a statewide model. We're also not forecasting future. We're modeling out to 2050 to understand what near-term decisions are needed to navigate uncertainty. This is also not a transmission planning model. And finally, we're not providing location-specific outputs or results for resources or transmission lines. So we will not be able to tell you whether something will or will not be built in your neighbor's backyard, for example. So I'm going to hand it over to Alan to talk a little bit more about the model. Alan, passing it to you.
Yeah, next slide, please. So thank you, Edith. As Edith described, the purpose of the modeling and the analysis we're doing here is very different than most of us are used to doing in least cost planning or IRP processes. The purpose of our modeling is not to create a resource portfolio for cost recovery like an IRP, but to inform the eventual recommendations of the Oregon State Energy Strategy. And we do that in a very specific way by comparing a reference case to different potential futures or pathways to see what we can learn and use to create our recommendations for the energy strategy that will help us achieve the Oregon's 3 energy policy objectives. So we start that by developing the reference case. We are not, as in an IRP modeling, trying to nail down a future portfolio of resources. We're trying to compare different pathways or scenarios to the reference case. So the reference case, along with all the scenarios, must achieve Oregon's 3 energy policy objectives: HB 2021, the CPP, and EO 20-4, 80% target for the remainder of the economy. So the starting point for all the model runs, reference case and scenarios, is that they must meet these 3 energy policy objectives. The reference case creates a portfolio of resources and actions that complies with those 3 objectives by using a very sophisticated model developed by Evolve, which has also been used and vetted in numerous other studies around the country, which is why we hired them. And it uses a least cost plan model along with inputted feasible but aggressive demand side inputs and other constraints like transmission to create that reference case pathway. And then the model, we turn it on, Jeremy runs it, and then it cranks out financial results and co-benefits and cost for the reference case. Click, Mary. We then next develop 5 different scenarios or pathways that will be compared to that reference case. All the scenarios start with the reference case. And then we change 1 or 2 or so things that we want to test. We're testing the what ifs. What if this or that happens? Again, all the scenarios meet the 3 energy policy objectives. For example, a scenario may look at a lower than expected electrification or lower than expected EV adoption or further constrained transmission than already is in the model, or constrained siting resulting in lower adoption of renewables. And we're going to get into that toward the end of the presentation today. Click, please, Mary. So when we compare the results from the scenarios back to the reference case, we compare the delta of the financial and co-benefit results that we get for each of those 6 runs. So the model doesn't give us any answers, but it does illuminate the difference between the reference case and the scenarios. And by doing this, we can gain a deeper understanding of the trade-offs between the reference case and the scenarios. And so the value of this comes into play during the phase of our process where we develop the state energy strategy recommendations. Click, Mary, please. So what do the deltas between these scenarios tell us? How do they inform the development of our recommendations? For example, if scenario 2 shows that has lower benefits and lower benefits and lower co-benefits than the reference case, we may want to come up with recommendations that help us avoid the outcomes of scenario 2, or make sure that we create recommendations that ensure the outcomes of the reference case. So the way that we're using this modeling is very different than how modeling is used for IRPs or least cost planning processes. And I hope this explanation, along with Edith's last slide explanation of what the analysis does and doesn't do, are helpful in your understanding about our process to create this state energy strategy. Next slide.
Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Andy Cameron, our working group lead for energy efficiency and load flexibility. I just want to add one more time the note that if you have any questions or comments, please post them in the chat. We're collecting them. We're not ignoring them. We'll circle back to them later. And just to say that we are presenting the really big levers in the reference scenario. We are developing a longer list of what's going into the reference scenario. Often it's information that was presented in the working groups in data, the slides that showed data sources, and we'll have that available next week. But for now, we're really just focusing in on the kind of the big pieces and the pieces where we have made some changes. So Andy, handing it over to you.
Thanks, Edith. Hi, everybody. Andy Cameron. I'm the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Manager here at Odo. Next slide, please. So in the efficiency and load flexibility group, we talked on a lot of subjects that have a bit of an overlap with the group dedicated to buildings and building componentry. Just a note that as we go through some of these items, we'll dive deeper when we get to the section on buildings specifically. But in our group, we really focused on end-use energy efficiency, load flexibility. We focused in on 3 sectors, those being residential, commercial, and industrial. And in the beginning of our meeting, we looked at the role of existing policy, and we talked a bit about the concept of backcasting, which is sort of looking backwards in time from a future scenario. Throughout all of these, we really tried to keep our future conditions feasible but aggressive, and parenthetical there to the year 2050. We covered data sources for existing stocks. We talked quite a bit about some key assumptions, both for energy efficiency and load flexibility. In the efficiency bucket, much like the buildings group, we touched on the building shell or envelope, space and water heating, appliances, and then average annual efficiency improvements for industry, some process engineering, things like that. With load flexibility, we honed in on appliance, batteries, and the role of EVs. We asked ourselves a series of what-if questions. Next slide, please, Mary. So some of the highlights in our meeting, and I apologize if some of the bold text isn't coming through here, but we talked about weatherization potential in buildings. We talked about heat pump water heaters and the fact that they're becoming more prevalent and showing up more and more in the marketplace, or expected to. Heat pumps, Oregon's got a 500,000 goal for deployment. There's some federal standards and technical issues around those, so we discussed those. We also talked a bit about demand response and how we can expect certain scenarios coming out of that with regards to EVs and batteries in particular. And finally, we touched on energy burden and equity. And I'll turn it back to you, Edith.
Thanks. We're going to run straight through the building slides, and then we'll land on the kind of details of the reference scenario and where we've landed following the working group meeting. So Blake, handing it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Edith. I'm Blake Schley, the manager of the Codes and Standards section at the Oregon Department of Energy. Next slide, please. So I'll just give a brief overview of some of the work that we did in the buildings working group. There was some overlap to some of the efficiency working group topics and discussions that Andy just went over, but in general, this group focused on efficiency and electrification in buildings, fuels, and then just general end uses that we typically see in buildings with regard to space and water heating, building shells, technology stock replacement, and then some like plug loads like cooking and other appliances, and then some assumptions related to lighting. And the group discussed a number of assumptions across these end uses for existing conditions and then various future conditions and reference scenarios, generally looking at it from an approach of looking at what existing policies are in place that we can reference for these future scenarios, and then backcasting from there to kind of look at what are the future scenarios and future conditions in 2030, 2035, 2040. And then if you were kind of wondering, like, what does backcasting mean? Kind of looking at the glide path from where we are today to, where we might be in those future dates, and how that trend affects our, overall achievement of our energy goals and where we need to be. And if something changes in that future date, how does that affect our overall trends toward achieving our goals? We talked a little bit about this, if some of our assumptions in the reference scenarios in the future are aggressive versus, maybe potentially more realistic assumptions, and, how does that affect the analysis in the future scenario, the other scenarios, the what ifs that we're going to look at in the future. And then just, some good input and discussion from the working groups about, data availability and making sure that we're using the best available data that we have. And then basing those future conditions on reference policy. Next slide, please. So just a couple highlights of the building section. So we allotted, discussion around state-specific data on heat pump sales, and hopefully getting, working with some of our partners to hone in on that data. Discussion on how gas equipment efficiency gains, so not just our heat pumps, how do those affect our our demand, but also how does efficiency gains and specific equipment, how are those being modeled? The need to potentially incorporate service demand reduction. So we've got this assumption for, like, if buildings are weatherized, what sort of savings does that achieve? But then there's other service demand reductions that could be incorporated into the model, such as operational changes, heat recovery, and things like that. And then also some discussion too about, and this kind of interacts with maybe some of the other working groups, and demand versus supply side, and how demand response in buildings affects the overall usage, and the grid interaction, and how load flexibility might affect things like energy burden, equity, adoption of new technologies, and things like that. So next slide, please. And I think with this, I'll turn it back over to Andy to talk about some of the model inputs and the starting points, and kind of some of the results and outputs of our discussions and suggested changes.
Yeah, thanks, Blake. A few notes before we dive into this slide. Again, we are modeling under the feasible but aggressive stance. On this slide, you'll see some things highlighted in orange. Apologies if orange doesn't necessarily jump out to you. We needed to base these inputs really on the best available data, the literature, real world experience, program data. Sometimes we don't have policies to guide us. Oftentimes we don't. So we had to make some judgment calls. We listened to you in the meetings. We've adjusted the assumptions based on comments coming in, and we're trying to balance an ambition of being too high in some cases and too low in others. And this slide kind of depicts where we've landed. So it's kind of a busy one. 3 columns. To the left, we've got the model input categories, recap of some of our starting points, and then in the rightmost column are our suggested changes, and that's where I'll focus my overview. In residential, we put a change in electric heat pump sales at 95% of overall sales by 2040. We had a earlier stated scenario of 90%. For small commercial, again, under the space heating input, we're going to follow the residential model. And then for large commercial, electric heat pump sales at 75% of overall sales by 2045. Under the water heating input category, incorporating federal energy conservation standards for consumer water heaters. Residential, we've stated that the sales of the electric heat pump models of those water heaters will be 95% of sales by 2045. Again, in this category, small commercial will follow residential. And then large commercial, 25% of the heat pump devices by 2030 and 90% by 2045. For building electrification, 95% of sales of new appliances are electric by 2035. That's down 5% from an earlier 100%. And for industrial processes, we have no stated changes. Next slide, please. Again, same format for this slide with input to the left, suggested changes on the right. For flexible loads related to EVs in both the commercial and residential sectors, no change. Vehicle to grid or V2G, again, no change. We have some questions as our current suggested changes for demand response in households, commercial, and industrial. And for that, the question is, what percentage of eligible stock is participating? And for customer-sited standalone storage, the question is, what level of grid services should we model? Thank you. And next slide, please.
Thank you, Andy. So my name is Michael Friels. I'm an analyst at Oregon Department of Energy, and I led the Direct Use Fuels and Industry Work Group. So this group was tasked with providing expertise on fuel and technology options that can meet future heating and industrial energy needs while achieving our state decarbonization targets. So if you're not familiar with direct use fuels, Oregon's most consumed direct use fuels are natural gas, biomass, heating oil, and other petroleum fuels. And decarbonization is likely going to come from reduced demand through efficiency improvements, electrification, and adoption of low carbon alternative fuels. So, thanks for the slide. So within the overview, we'll start with our discussion on modeling. And so we looked at modeling and how it'll give us a window into electricity, clean fuels growth, and operations needed to meet direct use fuel demand while decarbonizing over time. So electrification will occur in some applications where it's most cost-effective and feasible, but many other applications in industrial and other sectors will require an alternative clean fuel. And so the model optimizes capital investments and operations across all elements of clean fuel supply chains, including the feedstocks available to create them, how they're created, so what fuel conversion technology is used to create those alternative fuels, how they're delivered and how they're stored. And all those things will help us select which ones may be used. So examples of how direct use fuel demand may be met would include replacing hydrogen that's made now from fossil fuels with green hydrogen made from renewable electricity. That would be a good example. Using drop-in fuels to decarbonize fuel blends within existing infrastructure, or creating new markets or applications for direct use fuel use of alternative fuels like ammonia, hydrogen, or biofuels. So, and it's also important to understand the geography of the model. So the model focuses on Oregon, but we are taking a regional perspective, or I guess a regional and national perspective, that we're assuming the availability of clean fuels won't just come from Oregon, but may come from other areas nationally. Okay, next slide, please. So within this meeting, we started with some larger kind of discussion questions. And our first one was, what should the model assume for the cost and availability of alternative fuel pathways? So we discussed the availability of cleaner fuels and technologies, and we heard some concerns around the development of new alternative fuel infrastructure and limitations of existing technologies. So, which may mean we need longer adoption timelines, and that was certainly discussed. We also heard that broader national and Canadian energy markets will continue to influence Oregon's fuel costs and availability. So Oregon currently imports most of its direct use fuels, and there were expectations that Oregon will continue to import these fuels from other regions to meet demand, and that should be considered. And related, we discussed the relative dependence on regional development of clean hydrogen, renewable natural gas, and biofuel supply on Oregon's ability to access these fuels. We also heard about the importance of building out energy storage technologies, both electricity and alternative fuels, and the importance of understanding the costs and efficiency of storage options in the model to inform decision making. So our next discussion question was around potential technology opportunities that aren't necessarily fully developed, but how could they be reflected within the model? So we discussed that, and we heard from the working group that without substantial data, including like levelized costs for these technologies or potential resources that could become available soon, it shouldn't be included in the reference scenario. But there is value in providing information about future opportunities in Oregon in the analysis of the report. So it won't be part of the model, but could be part of the technical analysis in the report to highlight those future opportunities. And then we also discussed alternative scenarios that should be considered. So within those alternative scenarios or the what if questions, we talked about being able to test the consequences of not being able to develop particular parts of the energy economy. So for example, the availability of alternative fuels or electricity to meet demand. So what would be the cascading effects of one of those different scenarios? And that's kind of the vision of what those what if statements, what the value of testing those. We also request for a net zero decarbonized scenario to be included within the long to kind of demonstrate the long-term need and likelihood of a future policy. But we also heard from stakeholders that while there's concern that the reference scenario in itself with the 80% reduction would be really challenging and costly to achieve, and that in itself may not be realistic. So we heard kind of two different sides and two different options for the scenarios, whether a more advanced or more aggressive scenario or maybe a toned down scenario, not as aggressive. We also received requests to examine the economic benefits and challenges within the scenarios to demonstrate, workforce or other economic impacts. And it was exciting to have that conversation and hear that. So next slide, please. So just like Andy provided a table of kind of some of the data and assumptions that went into that's proposed to be in part of the reference scenario, I don't have time to go through each of the data, the starting point for the data that we're planning to use around data and assumptions, but I did want to highlight a couple items within this. In particular, for alternative fuels, it's really important to have accurate fuel stock and pricing assessments as we're evaluating the opportunity and when these alternative fuels may be available for use within Oregon. And one of the things we're targeting is the biomass data and taking a look at that right now. So we welcome recommendations if other stakeholders have some thoughts or feedback they'd like to provide. I certainly want to highlight there's value in providing that, and as well as these other data assumptions. Next slide, please. And within the industrial sector, we're also looking at changes in the industrial sector as far as electrification for low to moderate heat applications, but also high heat, the adoption of alternative fuels like hydrogen within high heat. And we're certainly interested in, we've got some starting point assumptions here, and we're wondering from the public and our work group members if these rate of adoption are aggressive or not aggressive enough, if they should be more conservative. We're certainly interested in hearing your perspectives on that. So I wanted to highlight those items. So Jillian, can you talk about Transportation Working Group?
I sure can. Thanks, Michael. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jillian DeMedio. I'm a senior policy analyst with ODO and the transportation lead on the Oregon Energy Strategy work. So I'm going to talk today about the work, what was covered in the Transportation Working Group. Next slide, Mary. So the Transportation Working Group focused on vehicle electrification, alternative fuels, vehicle miles traveled, and alternative and low carbon fuels. The meeting was really structured into four main topic areas. First, we reviewed how the model considers transportation. So it is part of our demand side modeling. And as we have explained in previous meetings, for all energy consuming technologies, including transportation, the model uses a stock rollover structure. So what this means for transportation is that we use existing data to establish what vehicle stock in Oregon looks like now across all on-road sectors, and then make assumptions about how vehicle technologies change over time. And those assumptions are guided by existing policies like Advanced Clean Cars 2, Advanced Clean Trucks, that require a percentage of vehicle sales to be zero emission vehicles by specific target years. This information is then used to generate a total energy demand. So based on the total amount of fuels required, so we look at how much gasoline, how much diesel, how much electricity, et cetera, to get that total energy demand. And obviously, to do this well, we need to use the best available Oregon-specific data around vehicle stocks, around vehicle miles traveled, fuel economy, and fuel demand, as well as Oregon policies and studies. So that's really the second topic of the meeting, was to review those transportation-related data sources and existing policies that do inform the model. Next, we discussed some key assumptions for future conditions. This is in particular for areas not covered by existing policy. So we focused here on two main discussion questions. The first was, what should the model assume for medium and heavy duty vehicles after 2035, which is the last year that targets are set through Advanced Clean Trucks? And the second question was, should we set targets for hydrogen in the transportation sector? And we really focused here on transit, long-haul trucking, rail, and maritime. Lastly, we talked about these what-if questions, and specifically transportation-related what-if questions that kind of reflect transportation concerns and priorities that may come up and that we may be able to explore through this scenario development process. Next slide. So just a few highlights from our discussion. We talked quite a bit about how aggressive medium and heavy duty electrification rates should be. And much of this discussion really focused on the existing barriers that are preventing transition to zero emission technologies in these sectors. So talked about technology limitations, the lack of charging and fueling infrastructure, the lack of supportive incentive funding, and the significant potential grid demands and grid upgrades required, just to list a few of those barriers that were mentioned. We also discussed the rates of hydrogen fuel cell penetration in various transportation sectors. And as I said, we really focused on transit, long-haul trucking, rail, and maritime. We discussed the timing of alternative fuels, so when and how much lower carbon fuels like renewable diesel, renewable natural gas, and ammonia would show up for various types of transportation vehicles. And then finally, the group talked about how to incorporate targets around reducing vehicle miles traveled into the model, whether we kind of assume that targets are met in the reference case or test that through an alternative scenario. Next slide. So this table shows the starting point assumptions that were presented to the group based on those two discussion questions mentioned earlier. For medium and heavy duty vehicles, starting point assumptions reflect, and this is post Advanced Clean Trucks, so starting in 2036, reflect the purchasing targets that have been established by California's Advanced Clean Fleets regulation, which requires 100% of medium and heavy duty vehicles purchased to be zero emission by 2036. As mentioned, many felt that these targets were too aggressive given the many barriers to medium heavy duty electrification. So we're now proposing to push this target back slightly and say 100% of these vehicles will be zero emission vehicle by 2040, or I should say new purchases, new sales. And you'll notice here that we are still proposing transit and school buses meet the original 2036 target. And that's really to reflect the many existing policies outside Oregon that are already more aggressive than this. So if you look at California's Innovative Clean Transit Rule, it requires new purchases of buses to be zero emission by 2029. So this is already quite a bit less aggressive than some existing policy. And for hydrogen, I'll say there was really mixed feedback as to what role hydrogen would play in transportation, particularly for medium and heavy duty vehicles. Some felt that the role would be really significant, and others expressed some uncertainty around these targets just due to the industry's nascency. So you can see here for on-road vehicles, we're assuming that hydrogen is playing a role for long haul and transit sectors only. And we did increase the percentage here to sort of reflect our conversation from 25%, from 20% hydrogen in 2040 to 25%. And there really was no disagreement on the starting point assumptions for rail and maritime. So those targets have been left as originally proposed. And then the last thing I'll say is not listed on this slide, but in our scenario discussion, we did have pretty strong support for exploring a slower electrification scenario. And again, that is another way of really addressing the many barriers that we talked about. There was also support for looking at sort of hydrogen scenario, so playing around with some of the hydrogen rates through an alternative scenario. And then lastly, a behavior change scenario that really looks at what happens economy-wide to the cost of decarbonization if we are successful in meeting our vehicle miles traveled reduction targets, and that's per capita. So I'll just highlight that we are, of course, still accepting feedback on these starting point assumptions through August 31st, as Edith mentioned. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason to talk about the transmission and distribution working group.
Thank you. So our group, let's see, go to the overview slide, thanks. I guess I can introduce myself again, Jason Searman, on the policy and innovation team, helping out with state energy strategy. My focus is transmission and offshore wind. But I was facilitating this working group. It was basically broken out across 4 main objectives. So this is kind of what our overview accomplished, what we did in our meeting. We reviewed the approach to the modeling of the transmission distribution system. We reviewed data sources that will build out the reference case. We discussed assumptions for future conditions. And we kind of ran out of time around then, but we also teed up a few what if questions for consideration and scenario development. I think it's important to kind of rehash and just summarize how the modeling does account for our transmission distribution system. So other than Oregon, California, each state has its own energy zone. The 2 states that have 2 different energy zones are Oregon. We have an east and west zone. That's helpful to, accounting for our big mountain range that separates our 2 zones and the transmission constraints that we need to account for. And then California also has a north and south zone. That's mostly to reflect that, there's transmission factors that roll into that with the DC line and then the AC connection. So the energy it is transferred between these states, in like a pipe flow model, literally with the pipes for the gas sector, and then similar analogy with the transmission lines, how much power can you deliver across these lines. Ability to transfer energy is modeled based on the flow ratings. I just kind of described that, so you have 2 different metrics, pipes versus wires. It's megawatts with wires and BTUs or volume of gas with pipes. We only modeled the major interstate pathways for the transmission, the electricity transmission. So it's not a detailed like nodal and hourly transmission study that a utility might do. The in-state transmission and distribution systems are very high level aggregations of what would be built in order to serve peak load within the state. So there really isn't a granular representation of in-state transmission. It's mostly these interstate connections that we're focused on, and the distribution costs, distribution system costs are based on historic cost data from EIA. So that's just kind of the helpful overview on how the modeling works. Let's go to the next slide. This is the highlight slide of what we heard throughout our meeting. I don't know if I need to read through all these, but for example, we spent a lot of time discussing how the existing transmission system is modeled, a lot of time addressing questions about which state and federal policies and programs are being modeled. We heard some skepticism about new gas pipelines coming to Oregon. We also heard questions about the distribution system and how that's modeled and how transmission expansion for offshore wind is modeled. So we did our best in the time we had to talk through all these topics, and we heard a lot of great feedback. We also heard some what if questions and teed up some what if questions, like what if electricity load growth is higher? What if transmission expansions out of state resources is limited to existing corridors? Or what if Oregon only relied on in-state resources to meet its energy needs and was less focused on, getting resources from other states? And, what if wildfire costs are higher than current forecasts is another kind of what if scenario. So all that said, let's go to the last slide here for our group. This is the suggested changes to assumptions slide. I will say that we didn't hear any of the feedback in our group, like specifically asking for changes around these words in orange on the right side of all these common slides we're showing folks. This is kind of for our group especially, these are still open questions. And so we're still looking for feedback is the bottom line. So especially with our starting point assumptions for how the reference case is going to model transmission and distribution for the gas and electricity systems. How are we going to model and account for these systems the way they are today, and how do we account for how they can be expanded? So I don't need to read through all these, gas pipelines. I think for the most part, people, like I said, there was some skepticism on new pipelines. Maybe we did talk about O&M, but we're looking for input still on that category. The power of place is our starting point assumption for the transmission data. Like I said, that's just the major interstate pathways. That means what is the ability to transfer X megawatts from one state to another. And that power of place has some cost to expand transmission. So, are these costs high enough? Open for input on that. East to west transfers across Oregon. I mentioned how Oregon is one of the states that has 2 zones. We're currently going to look to publicly available BPA data to help us with that. I will flag this one is ripe for some feedback, I think, because there's a few big projects across the Cascades that are teed up. They've been announced. I don't know how far along they are in the planning, but these are rebuilding projects, not new transmission projects. So along existing corridors, BPA and PGE are trying to rebuild these lines. Big Eddy to Chemawa and Round Butte to Bethel. Those are basically lines from Eastern Oregon to around the Salem area, crossing the Cascades. And we're not sure how long it's going to take, because I don't know if these projects, we have a rich history of timelines for rebuilding transmission projects. I don't know, what the timeline could be for that. And that kind of flows into this next line item, new transmission in general. We're not allowing the model to select new transmission until 2035. We are kind of hardwiring in, building in some projects that are already planned and under construction, like Boardman to Hemingway. We're going to plug that into our model for being online and available in 2025. The Gateway projects, I think we're going to model as 2035. So how should that timing work out? Are those dates good? What other input do folks have on that? And then the distribution system cost assumption. Like I said, this uses a proxy value based on historic costs from EIA. Are those historic costs like fully accounting for the costs we're experiencing today and we'll likely see a lot higher costs of in the future, right? So that, historic costs probably maybe aren't totally representative of upgrade costs resulting from electrification, more EVs, more buildings switching to electricity for their heating needs, extreme weather events, higher temperatures, wildfires, things like that. So I think that's another question I'll flag for folks too. If they have input, please submit that to us in writing. I think that wraps up the transmission distribution group. We do have a few other folks, maybe Rob and Michael on the call. I guess I can ask if I missed anything, but I think we're ready to switch topics. Yeah, keep going. Okay, I'll turn it over to the next presenter. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Looks like you all can hear me. Great. I'm Joni Slager. I'm a Senior Clean Electricity and Markets Analyst here at Odo. Edith Bayer and I were the co-leads for the Electricity Generation Technologies Working Group, and I'm excited to share more today with our combined groups here. Next slide, please. So as an overview, this group really focused on electricity generation. We covered everything ranging from rooftop solar to offshore wind was the scope for our group. Evolved Energy Research in our meeting presented on how the model treats electricity generation and answered some questions about the modeling and data input. On the next slide, I'm going to cover some of what we heard, but just to kind of understand how we framed the meeting up on our side, our presentation aimed to focus discussion by highlighting some of the key uncertainties that could affect how much generation we need and where that comes from. So some of the questions we talked about were how much new load growth we might see from data centers, how much load growth we might expect from existing sources due to electrification or other reasons. We talked about some of the development constraints around siting permitting, any concerns there. And we talked about deliverability constraints that could affect generation, such as transmission. Next slide, please. So I said, this is kind of just a couple of the things we heard in the meeting. It is not a comprehensive list, but we did hear some agreement that load growth and transmission is uncertain. Transmission limitations might limit development of generation. We heard some concerns about siting and land use as we look out to the future. And we also heard some interest on that in modeling more distributed energy resources. And we also heard interest in considering kind of job growth from different generation development opportunities and looking at that. And finally, we heard some interest and discussion on different resource types. So one thing the group discussed was nuclear. It's not a technology that the model will be able to select within Oregon. It's a constraint we have based on our existing energy policy. It is something the model would be able to select to be built outside of Oregon and then have transmission deliver. And then a big focus in the meeting we had was a lot of interest in biofuels and making sure that our modeling really fully values Oregon's timber basket as a resource. I love that phrase. Next slide, please. So here I've got a table, captures a couple of the different model inputs that we discussed and summarizes where we're at in proposing to use them in the reference scenario as of right now. Most of the assumptions we discussed we're not proposing to change. So using data from the Northwest Power and Conservation Council on data center load growth, or using the more conservative transmission cost estimates from the Nature Conservancy Power Play Study. Those are things we talked about, but we haven't heard specific concerns or suggestions for better data. So those are still, as of right now, what we're proposing to use. Something I've highlighted here in that dark orange relates to the conversation we had on biofuels. So we discussed some options there in the meeting. We discussed we could potentially do the same approach that was followed for the 2021 Washington Energy Strategy, which was using the U.S. Department of Energy's 2016 billion-ton study with some adjustments specific from a University of Washington model. I want to clarify so we're all clear that our current proposal and the data we're looking at right now is using the U.S. Department of Energy's updated 2023 billion-ton study. But we're still interested in really looking for better region and Oregon-specific data. So if you have suggestions, that's still something we're really interested in hearing about. So I know I walked through all of that really quick, but just zooming back out, I just want to thank everyone who came and thank you those who have shared some written feedback with us so far. We're looking through that, and we're looking forward to hearing more comments on or before the 31st. Thank you so much. And I think with that, I'll hand it to Lauren. Next slide, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lauren Rosenstein. I'm the Community Equity and Inclusion Analyst, and I've been working with the Environmental Justice and Equity Working Group. Next slide. For an overview of this group, this working group has been providing feedback, input, and expertise to understand and evaluate the benefits and burdens of energy choices on environmental justice communities. Their expertise informs how the energy strategy model can provide insight into community concerns about the energy transition and how the transition can lead to community benefits. This working group intersects with each of the other working groups and addresses environmental justice and equity considerations across topics. This group spent some time discussing additional analyses that will include the GIS mapping, energy wallet, and air quality. I encourage anyone who's interested in understanding that component more to review the meeting recordings. Next slide. For the focuses of our meetings, there was some uncertainty that was expressed that the current disparities won't change in the energy transition. Also, to identify need to distinguish between single family versus multifamily, renter versus homeowner, when thinking about the energy wallet. There was an interest in understanding how granular the approach can be. For example, when we look at rural as a whole, we want to know how that will be depicted as different from rural on the coast to different in Eastern Oregon. There was scenario planning for different load demands are recognizing, that scenario planning for different load demands are tied to economic development, and recognizing that the model only gives us trade-offs and there are more conversations necessary to dig into policy. Next slide. For some of the highlights, this group reflected on many of the reference scenarios that were highlighted in the other working groups with an environmental justice and equity lens. So while there's not a table here, please know that the previous tables shown were utilized in our discussion. And many of the conversations that we were having began to explore the policy level of this work and the additional upcoming analysis that will include the geospatial mapping, the energy wallet, and air quality. This working group looked forward to policy conversations with the understanding that the model can't take into account all of the potential barriers. There's a recognized need to weigh societal benefits while understanding that not all technology is equal in the potential adverse impacts on communities. While the model does not directly consider wildfires, the group identified that wildfires are an important part of the conversation. And there are limits to the model, and the group wondered if there's room to think about how the model can address community resilience. That's all from me. I'm going to pass it back to my colleague, Michael.
Thank you, Lauren. So hello again. So I'm going to talk about the Land Use and Natural Resources Working Group. So this group was tasked with using our expertise and experience on existing land use policies and interests to provide feedback on data and assumptions while balancing the growing energy needs with needs to protect the environment, economic needs, and societal interests. So next slide, please. This work group provided feedback on land use and natural resource screens to determine the feasibility of where new and long-lived energy resources can go. This is going to be key for our near-term policy decisions for a sustainable energy future. So how much can be developed? How much do we want to develop? And so we started that with looking at a high-level discussion question of what level of resource siting limitations should be incorporated into the model. So to determine what land use recommendations to make, the working group had to first understand the model and how it evaluates energy development. The model doesn't cite specific projects at specific locations in Oregon. It looks at total availability of land for energy development projects. So the exercise isn't so much to identify specific locations where sites could be located. Instead, we need to determine how much of Oregon is available for energy development as a whole and screen out areas where we are less likely to see energy development projects. We also need to understand the geography of the model. So Oregon is broken up into two zones in the model, so east and west. And we're evaluating the siting energy development projects in Oregon, but they're also a regional impact. So for example, if we cite fewer generation projects in Oregon, we'll need transmission and be dependent on other states for power. So if you go to the next slide, we evaluated the Nature Conservancy's Power of Place West study and Oregon's Renewable Energy Siting Assessment tool to determine how we could create a reference scenario for the energy model based on reasonable land use assumptions. We heard from the working group that this was a good way to consider land use for these scenarios, but it may be better if we could improve on the data with more recent Oregon-specific data sets, and in particular focusing on the marine environment. And so the staff, including myself, investigated how we could enhance these existing data sets in Power of Place with more information from the ORISA tool or a wind map or other sources. And unfortunately, we determined that it would take several steps that we don't currently have the time or resources to do to get into the greater detail and improve upon those screens. But it is important that we capture this idea within the report and identify it as a future opportunity with more time and resources that we could pursue in the future, but we're not able to do it now. So we arrived at the following recommendation. So looking at this table, we recommend using Power of Place West as level 1 and level 2 categories of exclusion in the reference scenario. So these are the legally protected area and administratively protected areas. And then the group also recommended an alternate scenario that includes all three categories, so level 3 as well, of exclusion to test a more limited availability of land use resources. Next slide, please. So beyond just those screens, the land use and natural resources group took a look at some other, discussed some other issues that came up in some of the other meetings. And so I know Jillian already highlighted kind of the vehicle miles traveled conversation, and we had that conversation within the land use meeting as well, and discussed the spatial planning opportunity within reducing vehicle miles traveled and whether that should be in a reference scenario or an alternative scenario. And after some interesting discussion, we decided that due to the historical challenges of reducing vehicle miles traveled across the state, the working group recommended not putting a vehicle miles traveled target within the reference scenario, but instead that might be a great option for an alternate scenario, a what-if scenario of a more robust reduction target, like the 20% reduction by 2050 in Oregon's existing transportation plan. So the group also talked about environmental justice and equity concerns, and we heard from working group members some issues or some concerns around siting facilities in communities that don't receive direct access to that power or the energy generation or its benefits directly, and some real concerns about that. It was highlighted the importance of including some analysis within the report, and maybe that can be brought up again in the policy recommendations phase of the energy strategy development. We also heard concern around the model, how the model will balance energy and non-energy benefits with the impacts on land use, and some questions and concerns around how a least cost model can really select the best resources for Oregon. And then we talked about what we want to see out of the technical analysis, and we certainly heard from the working group the need to learn from kind of siting impacts and water consumption issues and within the reference scenario, as well as testing with alternate scenarios, as well as kind of biomass consumption. And there's opportunity to learn from the model in those scenarios. And then finally, in the what if scenarios, we heard a variety of different great ideas for potential what if scenarios that we could test. So what if we can't import clean power from out of state? What if there's more distributed generation? So for example, more solar on existing rooftops or brownfields in urban centers. What if there isn't a regional electricity market? What if we include other non-emitting energy sources that Oregon currently doesn't allow, like small modular reactors? What if the energy generated by these new projects developed in Oregon does not go to actually serve Oregon markets? And there were many more, and these were all great recommendations, and we request that you keep the feedback coming. I really appreciate it. Edith?
Thanks, Michael. Mary, can you take us to the next slide and the one after that? We're now going to present the draft reference scenario. This is not something that we've presented as a whole because we were focusing in the working groups on key assumptions that would feed into the draft reference scenario and data sources. And it took all of the working groups meeting and then us synthesizing those overlapping topics to come up with a draft. So this is the first time anybody gets to see it, and we're really happy to have gotten to this point. Just to lead into the Jeremy's presentation of the draft reference scenario key assumptions, I just wanted to remind everybody that we are including 3 anchor policies that we're modeling towards in this analysis. So we have an economy-wide target set by Executive Order 2004 of at least an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We have House Bill 2021 that sets a 100% clean electricity goal from our state's IOUs by 2040. And we have the Climate Protection Program that sets a 90% greenhouse gas emissions reduction target by 2050. So these are the anchor policies that are driving greenhouse gas emissions reductions across the economy and shaping how we produce and consume energy over time. And at the same time, we have numerous other important policies that help drive and shape compliance pathways. And these include some of the ones that you see down here, such as the Clean Fuels Program, Advanced Clean Cars 2, Advanced Clean Trucks, Building Codes, Appliance Standards, and many more. Our approach in the model will be to incorporate these policies into the model to build in compliance with existing laws and policies into the pathways that go out to 2015. And so with that, I just wanted to kind of set up the sort of policy framing. And Jeremy, I'm going to hand it off to you to show us to describe the draft reference scenario. Thanks. And Mary, maybe you can jump to the next slide.
Thanks very much, Edith. So we've heard a lot of these things going through the individual sectors already in the discussions that happened in the working groups. As Edith was describing, this is distilling that information and coming up with a set of assumptions that describing the reference case based on that input. So starting off with the supply side, I'll go through the supply side. The next slide is on the demand side. The supply side, starting from the top level economy-wide GHG targets, this is what Edith was describing. We are meeting the Executive Order 2004 80% GHG reduction goal. And then drilling down into electricity, we have HB 2021. Fuels, we have the Climate Protection Program. So the reference case is going to meet all of those policies, as will the other scenarios that we're testing. And that's kind of our overall driver for the scenario, the thing that in investing in new technologies and trying to find a least cost pathway through all of these different energy supply chains, that's what we're trying to achieve over time and through to 2050. Electricity generation technologies, the technologies that we're including in the model have some kind of basis already in development in current commercialized projects. So you see a list there of some of the technologies that we're including. The things that we're not including are those that are more research-based. So if it's lab-based or just at that early stage of pilot testing, then we're generally not including those technologies because there isn't enough of a track record to know how much they're going to cost, whether they're going to be commercially viable. We are not including any siting of new natural gas in Oregon or new nuclear power plants, but we can draw on energy that's coming from those types of resources in other states. Generation and interconnection siting restrictions, Michael described the kind of screening that goes into identifying land where new projects can be located. And that's through the level 1 and level 2 screening from the Power Place West study. And then Inflation Reduction Act incentives, these are applied to all of the technologies that have been earmarked for different types of tax incentives or other incentives. So things like hydrogen production, renewable electricity generation, battery storage, carbon capture, clean fuels, out-of-state nuclear. And then transmission availability, as Jason talked through, we're on the kind of the macro level at the state level using the Nature Conservancy Power Place West to characterize what are the existing transmission capabilities and then what are potential opportunities for expanding that. And then we have this east and west zone within Oregon that we're using data from BPA to characterize what are the existing transmission constraints and then potentially what can we do to expand those. We're not allowing new interzonal transmission to be built until 2035, with the exception of some projects that are already under construction today. And I noticed there was one question about the timing of Hemingway, and we said 2025, but I think that should probably be 2030, just given where we are with construction there. And then on the fuel side, then we're optimizing the capital investment and operations of all of the different fuel supply chains. So that is commodity through different energy conversion processes, storage, transportation of those fuels, delivery of those fuels. And this is looking beyond Oregon's borders. So Oregon is part of national markets for fuels, and there are different delivery costs associated with bringing fuel into Oregon, we could develop clean fuels outside of Oregon and then import them into the state. And we are modeling the competition for those fuels between Oregon and other states. So Oregon is not decarbonizing in a vacuum, and this is true of the electricity sector as well. All of the states around Oregon and other places in the US are also pushing towards achieving targets in the future. And so where does a limited set of resources fit into that picture? Next slide. So moving to the demand side. So data center load growth. This is one of the big uncertainties, and it could be pretty significant in the coming years. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council has put together a forecast of what data center load growth might look like. So we're planning to use that as our reference case level of growth. Residential electrification, so space heating and cooling, electric heat pump sales, 95% of overall sales by 2040. Water heating, electric heat pump sales rising to 95% of overall sales by 2045. And then in commercial, space heating and cooling, small buildings will follow the residential targets, and large buildings, they'll go to 75% heat pump sales by 2045. And then in water heating, small, again, following the residential targets, large achieving 25% of all new large commercial HVAC are heat pumps by 2030 and 90% by 2045. Then moving on to transportation, and Gillian highlighted these assumptions earlier, but just to summarize these and bring them all together here, on the light duty side, going to 100% battery electric vehicle sales by 2035. Transit and school buses, 100% zero emission vehicles by 2036. And transit, 75% battery, 25% hydrogen. And then medium and heavy duty, 100% zero emission vehicles by 2040. And long haul, 75 battery electric and 25% hydrogen. And then in industry, we have a couple of ways that we're bringing transition in energy consumption into industry. The first is on process efficiency. So the amount of heat and steam and electricity, etc., that is used in the process to produce an output, and improvements in the efficiency of that process over time. And so we're starting from, in the reference case here, 1% average annual improvement across all industries. And that, part of that is a recognition that we don't know specifically what is possible in different industries. And so the 1% is kind of a intentionally high level sort of estimate of what kind of efficiency improvements we might see. And then the other part that is not highlighted here is fuel switching in industry. So in the energy conversion processes, for example, in production of steam, then the model can invest in electric boilers or dual fuel boilers or hydrogen boilers to produce that steam. Things like motors to produce kinetic energy, fuel switching from fossil fuels into electricity. And so a variety of different fuel switching measures as well. And then the final one here is on distributed energy resources. So we will include the Northwest Power Council's forecast, most recent forecast of rooftop solar projections over time. And then on top of that, as was summarized earlier, we have assumptions about what happens to flexible loads and participation of different eligible loads over time. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Edith.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I just want to check, Jeremy, we're a little bit behind schedule. Are you okay to stay on for a few minutes to take a few questions?
Sure.
Okay. So Jessica, I think I'll turn to you to see if you want to tee up some of the questions that we've been seeing in the chat throughout the meeting for Jeremy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've seen a few questions about buildings, so I'll start with those right now. These are, I think, for Jeremy, but Edith, feel free to jump in too. The first question is from John. He asked, did the building conversation contemplate adjustments to engineering requirements that would provide for additional rooftop solar on larger buildings that are load constrained due to current construction standards?
That's a good question. So at the moment, what we have on rooftop solar is this forecast that's coming from the Northwest Power Conservation Council, and that's not all of the potential that's out there. That is a forecast of how much they think is going to be adopted over time. We then in the model have additional potential of how much more rooftop solar could be built, but that tends not to be selected given the economics of the rooftop versus grid scale resources. But in potential scenarios, not the reference case, but in other scenarios that we look at, maybe we look at more constrained resource siting and permitting constraints. And in those cases, then perhaps rooftop solar becomes a larger component of this. And so I think that we have some additional thinking we can do about what is the overall potential of rooftop solar. In general, if we have access to these other lower cost resources, we probably won't exceed the potential. But for those kind of constrained scenarios, I think it's a good question and one for us to look into.
Thanks, Jeremy. And the second question about buildings I have is wondering, is multifamily considered residential in the model, or is it something else?
In our model, it is considered residential, but that's just kind of it's a classification that we have in our model, and we can use whatever assumptions we want for that. And so I don't think that we need to confine ourselves to that being the definition. It's just the way it's treated and the way our model is set up.
Great. Okay, so going to some next questions I have, these are really around the flexible load opportunities that you might have for things like electric vehicles or smart appliances. And wondering why in the reference case, there's really no vehicle to grid, which is sometimes abbreviated as V2G assumption in that. And we had a follow-up to that where Eric indicated that EVs have about 10 times the storage installed by utilities, and this is only going to grow. So he's wondering why we don't include that V2G, since that's such an amazing amount of capacity to have.
So we definitely have the capability of modeling vehicle to grid. And so if that is something that people think that should be in there, then we can definitely include it. I think that the customer participation level of vehicle to grid is likely to be quite different from the participation level for managed charging, just given the optics of availability of your vehicle. And so that's one thing to consider in setting up assumptions for vehicle to grid. Then perhaps participation would be lower than just charging overnight at your home. But we're open to including that if that's something that that people think is important.
Thanks, Jeremy. So now I want to move into a transportation related question. This comes from Rachel. It says, it looks like that Odo has, this will be a question for you, Edith, I think, or potentially, I'm sorry, Jillian. It looks like we're assuming a more aggressive approach to California's innovative clean transit rule, which requires 100% zero emission transit buses by 2040. And there's just wondering why that assumption was baked into the reference scenario. So I don't know, Edith or Jillian, if you want to add to that question.
I'm happy to address that, Edith. And thanks for the question, Rachel. So my understanding of the Innovative Clean Transit rule is that it actually requires 100% of new purchases by transit agencies to be zero emission buses by 2029. And then that it basically ensures a goal of reaching an all electric fleet by 2040. So the purchase requirement is set at 100% in 2029, not 2040. So what we're proposing is 100% of new sales to be zero emission in 2036, which is actually 7 years later than the requirement in the Innovative Clean Transit rule.
Thanks, Jillian. I'm going to move to some questions for Jeremy again. So this is getting into regional markets for the electricity sector. And the question is, how are we accounting for regional market development and also potentially the risks of two markets? And we had several iterations of this particular question from a number of people. So I wanted to throw that out there for Jeremy.
Sure. So the model is a physical representation of the system. So the generators, transmission, the loads, and it is dispatching the WEC as if it's a single system operator. And so in the near term, that is not going to be as realistic as a model that is capturing the specific market conditions and the friction between zones, etc. In the long term, that is the paradigm that I think that we need for a study going out to 2050, because all of those efforts to reform markets that are going on right now are all efforts in the vein of making the system more efficient and to be able to achieve these more efficient outcomes in the future. And so by using a model that is dispatching efficiently across the West, it's kind of setting us up for long-term targets that we can use as guideposts for what we could achieve in the future if we pull on all of these levers that we have available to us in the long term.
Thanks, Jeremy.
The one thing I'd add to that is that it is in the near term, I think that this long-term modeling is complementary to the types of modeling that is going on in these various efforts, because they are taking this shorter term regional look that will give us much more information about our transmission system and the way it's operated, that can be complementary to the results that are coming out of this kind of modeling effort.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm going to move on to some transmission questions. We have several people comment that it does take a long time for new major transmission lines to move through the permitting process. In fact, 10 to 15 years is something that's been flagged in the comments and in other places. We also had folks just talking about how Boardman to Hemingway is showing some additional delays, and that the 2025 date for Boardman to Hemingway coming online may not be likely. So questioning why that was the assumed year for that. And just in general questions around what the assumptions are around transmission build in the model.
Yeah, I do think that 2025 is too early for Boardman to Hemingway. So 2030 would be our time step when that would become available. 2035 is the date for new build in our reference case here. Any type of builds, whether it's reconductoring or co-location or new greenfield transmission, recognizing that these timescales are really long, and that's 11 years from now. So I think it's reasonable, and given the timing that we've seen on other lines, maybe some of those lines would slip. But I think that siting and permitting of transmission and renewables is one of the largest factors and largest uncertainties that's going to change the strategy for Oregon in the future. And so in the what if questions and other scenarios, a case or a scenario that is looking at those lines slipping, or less availability in general of building out transmission and or renewables is probably one of those key things that we should be looking at, and we can explore delays in that case.
Thanks, Jeremy. So now a couple more questions following on about that. So considering the challenges of building new transmission lines, we had a few questions that we're looking at how the model can capture transmission enhancing technologies like advanced conductoring and dynamic line ratings, more efficient uses of those things. And yep, I think that's it now. So how does the model account for those types of technologies?
So we have done studies that include those in the past, where we're looking at the benefits of superconducting lines or reconductoring existing with superconductors, and so we can include that. I would say that the challenge with it is that we are using this pipe flow representation, zonal pipe flow, and when you expand an existing transmission line from its current rating to say 10 times or 5 or 10 times its current rating, then the other auxiliary effects that are happening on the transmission network may actually be the limiting factors. So the AC power flow constraints that would stop you from being able to utilize a line of that rating. And so knowing how to characterize that in the model is difficult. What are the costs associated with actually expanding a path rating by 5 or 10 times its current rating? The costs are not just for the reconductoring of that line, it's also the costs of strengthening the grid around that too. And with our model, it's quite tricky to capture that without having done separate power flow analysis to be able to characterize the costs associated with it. So with that caveat, I would say that we have the option to do it, but it would be probably better addressed through a much more detailed nodal transmission model.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I want to move on to a couple other newer technologies that people are interested in and how the model will account for them. The first one is wondering how small modular nuclear reactors are included or not included in the model.
So we're including small modular reactors. We can't build them in Oregon, but we can build them other places. And the way that they're included is that we can build the reactor. The reactor produces low temperature nuclear heat. That heat could be stored or it can be sent to a steam turbine. The steam turbine is sized separately from the SMR. And the locating the SMRs, we can get additional IRA benefits from building them on brownfield sites, and so that additional incentive is included in the model as well.
Great. And one other question about hydrogen, and there's kind of a number of places that hydrogen might show up within the model. It could be used for electricity generation, it could be used as a transportation fuel, and it could be used in as a mix or on its own to heat. How is that accounted for in the model?
So the fuel supply chains, there are multiple places, as the questioner notes, that hydrogen can come into play there. And we are building out the physical pathways by which that can happen. So hydrogen can come from steam methane reforming with carbon capture, electrolysis, and the hydrogen can then go into multiple different processes. So it can go into methanation injected in gas pipelines. It can go as a direct injection into gas pipelines or into 100% hydrogen pipeline that is separately costed, or into liquid fuels production. So into Fischer-Tropsch producing different fuel fractions for drop-ins into different fuel blends, or into ammonia production that could be used in shipping fuel or conventional ammonia consumption.
Thanks, Jeremy. And we have some questions around load growth. So I thought it might be helpful to answer the question of whether PNUC's load growth is being considered or used in the model. But in general, how is load growth determined by the model? And along with that, how is population growth included in the model that will drive that demand?
So we're not using PNUC's load forecast because those are top-down load forecasts that are based on a set of underlying assumptions that don't necessarily align with the assumptions that we have on this slide, for example. The way that we produce our load forecasts is that we are building up bottom up from all of the energy consuming technologies across the economy. So we are benchmarking what the economy looks like today, all of the water heaters, air conditioners, vehicles, etc. And then as we move forward in time, how those stocks change. So they'll change based on what kind of sales of new equipment, new heat pumps, new electric vehicles happen in future years. And also they'll change based on population growth or industrial growth. And the population growth, in the past, it's come from annual energy outlook, but we're updating that with Oregon specific population growth forecasts. And so all of those things factor together to produce a load forecast based on, what does service demand look like over time? How's that changing with population? And then what is the demand for energy based on the types of technology, the efficiencies of those technologies over time.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. So I'm going to do a couple more questions for you, and then we'll move over to the rest of the Odo team to answer the remaining questions. So I have a really easy one. Do we include VMT reduction in the reference case?
Not in the reference case. But as we noted in the transportation section here, that was something that people were interested in looking at, and it's something that we can model in another scenario.
Thanks. And VMT is vehicle miles traveled. It's a term that references how many miles the average car drives in Oregon every year. I guess the last question that I'll ask is, does the model include cost trends for transmission distribution, residential, commercial, and utility scale solar generation, utility battery storage, electric vehicles, virtual power plants, heat pumps for space and water heating, et cetera? Does it have cost trends that will come from the model or inform the model?
Yeah, so these are not dynamic in the model. So we're not seeing more cost reduction in heat pumps if we build more heat pumps, for example, which is the appropriate way, I think, for a state analysis, just given that prices are going to be driven by national or global markets. But we are including publicly available forecasted cost information for all of those technologies over time. And so we're seeing decreases happen with vintages further in the future of all of these technologies. The one thing mentioned in that list that we do not do that for is transmission distribution. The transmission and distribution costs that are not explicit in the model, so not the interzonal transmission, but the intrazonal, so distribution or transmission within the Eastern Oregon zone, for example, that is using historical data on what distribution or transmission costs were in the past and using those going forward.
Great. Edith, are there any other questions I've missed in our list that you think Jeremy should ask before we move over to our team?
I don't think so. I think that there might be some questions that we'll have to circle back to in writing. But unless there's somebody from the team who wants to flag something, I think we might move on to other questions.
Thank you, Jeremy. We very much appreciate your time and efforts to help get us all up to speed on how this model works. It's been really fascinating to get to learn it.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll move on to a few other questions. Michael, I have a clarifying question that came from Rebecca, and she's asking wondering if that she heard correctly that the feedback that we've received about emerging technology opportunities should not be included in the reference scenario if there isn't good data on the levelized cost of energy for that technology. Is that correct? Is that what you were saying during your fuels presentation?
Yeah, great question, Rebecca. Thank you for clarifying. So yes, that's what I heard from our working group, that unless there's clear data on emerging technologies, it shouldn't be in the reference scenario. But I would certainly welcome your feedback and feedback from all of our working group members on if that should be the case. And I think it makes sense if there isn't really defined data available to inform that reference scenario, then we probably shouldn't make estimates about it. But that is certainly an opportunity to include it within an alternate scenario and come up with some estimates around what that could look like and what would the impact be.
Thanks. Apologies, I had a cat technology issue there for a second. Edith, I have a question for you. This comes from Shannon, and she's wondering why compliance with the Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS, is not included as a pretext for reference and alternative scenarios.
Thanks, that's Shannon, for the question. So we expect, but we'll have to check once we've run the model on the reference, that we'll find the RPS we'll find that the model is delivering compliance essentially with the RPS. So we're not building it in for that reason, because we see that HB 2021 is going to drive so much clean energy uptake that we're using that as the constraint on the model that we're solving for. But the RPS is a really good example of something that we will have to check when we see the model results to see how they align with RPS requirements, to be sure that there's no conflict there.
Thanks, Edith. Moving into some questions around fuels, and there are several questions that kind of focus around how we're calculating the emissions associated with fuel consumption. And so I think folks are basically trying to get at, there's two ways to look at fuels as far as greenhouse gas emissions go. The one way is to look at what we call in-state and boundary emissions. Those are the ones that are tracked and used for the Department of Environmental Quality's greenhouse gas inventory. But other programs, particularly the Clean Fuels program, look at a life cycle of fuels, which would include not only what is emitted, say, from the tailpipe of a car, but also emissions associated with the extraction of the petroleum, the refining of the petroleum, the transportation of that petroleum to get where it's actually put into the car. Edith, I'll pass it to you to kind of talk about how the emissions are characterized in there, but I just wanted to tee it up so people kind of got the flavor of why that question is important.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? Because I got lost during the thread on the question.
Sorry. Yeah, so the question is, how are emissions being calculated in the model? Are they using the full life cycle emissions, or are they using just the in-boundary greenhouse gas inventory type emissions that DEQ tracks?
So I think I might need Alan to help me answer this question. I know that we're using the DEQ emissions inventory. I don't know if that fully answers the question. Alan, is there something that we should add to that?
The DEQ inventory only captures the greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon. So that's what we're basing, and it's a sector based. So we're not doing. We're basically following the footprint that DEQ uses in our analysis, and that's what our goals are based on as well.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Edith. Edith, along those lines, there's also questions around what information the model will provide to us around air pollution effects. So beyond just greenhouse gas emissions, looking at things like diesel emissions and NOx and other types of criteria pollutants. What will the model tell us about air pollution emissions from, say, biomass consumption to generate electricity, or from transportation fuels use, all the different energy sources?
Thanks. So the core energy system model will just give us a mix, a fuel mix, and emissions, kind of total emissions coming from different sources. So each scenario might look a little bit different. We're going to take those results and then run the EPA's COBRA model, which looks at criteria pollutants and the link between that and pollutant-induced health effects, and to develop a more detailed understanding of what the effects are of criteria pollutants in the different scenarios on public health.
Thanks, Edith.
So in that sense, it goes beyond just greenhouse gas emissions into those NOx. Mostly particulates is causing most of the problems, but other of the 7 criteria pollutants. So that's what the EPA COBRA model looks at and calculates that in terms of increases or decreases in mortality rate, hospitalization, lost work, all these different factors that are involved in the COBRA model, and then calculates a value associated with that. So that's how we're using that pretty commonly used US EPA COBRA model to calculate the health benefits associated with change in air quality associated with each of the different scenarios.
Great, thanks. Now I'm going to move into some land use focused questions. So there's a lot of interest in how and where we might start considering filters for land use. And I think that we've had a number of comments around, like, maybe today you aren't allowed to build, say, a solar facility on specific land use. Would the model enable us to filter for areas that people think should be considered where we could build solar, even though today that wouldn't be allowed?
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think at this point, the model is kind of binary when it looks at land of, like, is this available to be used or not? And I think that, but usually when we look at land use filters, we look at kind of likelihood to be used. And so no land use is impossibly used. And I know we had that kind of what if question of what if public lands were available for energy development. And I think there's an opportunity within the scenarios to kind of look at either reducing restrictions if we hear that's a desirable. I mean, I know I mentioned we looked at a more restrictive scenario, but we could look at a less restrictive scenario or more options available. If anything, we want to show within those data filters kind of the challenge of siting facilities and limited land available. And we certainly know, I mean, I believe within the chat, farmland was mentioned, and we certainly recognize that, you know, farmland has been used for utility scale projects, and so completely excluding that would create some challenges. And so there may be opportunity to do like a percentage of farmland is available or something like that. If anything, we would really appreciate feedback from working group members on their recommendations for those filters. We are kind of limited on the data available and how much we can play around with those numbers, but we would welcome that feedback so we can take a look and see where the opportunity is.
Great. Thanks, Michael. So the next question is, I think I'm going to move to Edith for this one. Will we be considering floating offshore wind energy to be commercially available during the timeline of the energy strategy model, which is through 2050?
I'll answer this as best I can. Jeremy would give a more complete answer, but yes, it is available to the model, and Jeremy will be making assumptions around kind of what the costs are for that compared to other resources. So the model will has the option to reach for floating offshore wind as one of the technologies that's available to it.
Great. And then I have a question around how we're defining tribal lands. So this is, I apologize, this is heading back to the land use question, but I lost it for a minute. How are we defining tribal lands? Are they reservation only, or are they also including reservation culturally significant sites?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that one. I think we'd have to look it up. I guess initially I will say that I think it's probably the reservations, but it may include culturally significant sites, but I just don't know for sure. So we're gonna have to look that up and find out more how that's filtered in greater detail. So thank you for the question.
And Edith, I want to come back to you. There's a question here that I've seen asked. I think it was only asked once in this, but I wanted to flag it because it's been asked in multiple places, which is whether the scenarios, the reference scenario, would consider the potential for significant snowpack reduction, which would have effects on our hydro system.
We're still working out how we're going to kind of exactly what we're going to do in this area. So I don't have a clear answer, but we're aware of the risk of less snowpack and that changing hydro availability in different times of the year. So I think it may be an unsatisfactory answer for the person asking the question, but we have it in mind. We have a very simplified version of the hydro system. It's not a really complex kind of hydro flow model that goes dam by dam. And so I think we're working out how exactly we'll account for the potential for reduced snowpack.
Great. And just want to flag that as far as like some of the hydro assumptions that go into the model, if you want to watch the energy generation technologies work group meeting, just that work group, Jeremy, the modeler, had a lot more information about that to follow up. And that is available on our webpage, all the links to the recordings. Okay, I'm sorting through. There was a lot of good questions here today. So I just want to flag that Shannon had asked that question about whether we're including the RPS in the modeling assumptions. She followed that up with, and it got separated from the original question, but I just wanted to flag it. There are other energy policies in the state, like Solar for All, which is an incentive program that's bringing money to put solar in throughout Oregon, rooftop solar, not utility scale solar. There's a community solar program. There's PURPA. Don't ask me, please, to spell out what PURPA means. I can never get it right, but that is a program at the federal level that incentivizes. It doesn't incentivize, but it encourages the development of small scale renewable energy resources. So I just want to flag that she had asked that too, and we'll be getting back to you all in writing on more about how we are incorporating these other energy policies that are happening in the state into our assessment. And a lot of this will be, we can dive into more when we get to the policy discussions that will happen next year. We had a couple of questions around whether or not the climate protection program funds that help support the growth of certain resources, like could be community solar, could be things like home and business solar, it could be micro hydro generation, how that might be incorporated into the model. And that might be a Jeremy question. If it is, we'll take it offline.
Can I just add, and I'm sort of looking to Alan through the virtual space on this, but will we have, I'm not sure that we'll have the information that we need to include that in the reference scenario in time to have the actual amounts, the actual amount of money.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Yeah. So I think there's a timing issue here that where it might just not be possible to include that in the model.
The exact amount, anyway.
You're right.
And I'll add to that, just to remind people that this is the first iteration of the modeling for the Oregon Energy Strategy, and we were asked by the legislature to update this. So there will be additional iterations of it going forward, and obviously this information that might not be available to us this time around, that we're just going to miss by our mark of when we have to get the modeling done, are things that we can incorporate into the next model update when we get there. And I'm reaching the end of the questions I think that we have. There's some questions that we're gonna that are very specific to things that aren't necessarily directly energy strategy related, like what's the transmission plan for a specific line, that sort of thing. I won't be covering those here because they're not actually part of what we're doing. But just to let people know that we saw the question, and if we can answer it, we will find you somebody who can help. And then I think we're at just probably at time almost, Edith, and I know you have one more slide you wanted to cover. So I will just end this by saying, if we didn't get to your question, please know that we will, we've got these all captured and we can provide responses once we can organize these and help make responses that are clear and hit all the marks for the things that we didn't get to hit today. So that is coming, and we really appreciate all of the engagement and activity in the chat today. This is very helpful to us as we think about what our next steps will be in getting the draft reference scenario through to finalization with all of your comments. Don't forget that you can continue to add comments through our comment portal by August 31st, and I will throw the link into that portal into the chat here as soon as Edith takes over. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Jessica. And I just want to answer Nikita's question because it goes to kind of the process. There's no, the bill just says that the energy strategy should be updated periodically, so it doesn't say how often. We've talked about roughly every 4 years, but it's not decided yet. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And I see that even as Jessica was speaking, new questions were coming up, but we have to wrap it up. So as Jessica said, we'll get back to folks on those questions. So I just wanted to show one more slide that I think is important for everyone to have in mind. If you can go to the next one. Thanks, Mary. Because we've been focusing on the reference scenario. So given the tight timeline, we've decided to take the alternative scenarios out of the picture for now and really focus on the reference. And that's been the focus of today's conversation. But the reference really, it's the starting point for comparison, as Alan was showing, to what happens if something's different. And it's that comparison where a lot of the value actually is of this analysis and understanding the implications of different potential futures. And there are a lot of risks and a lot of unknowns. So it's really important to test some of these risks out and define which ones are most important to test and can tell us the most information. And the way that we've been teeing up that part of the discussion is by asking folks to share kind of what if questions. And we've been collecting those, and this is just a very rough first glance at some of the themes that we see coming out. So I just want to be really clear, like these are not suggested scenarios. We only have 5, by the way. There are more than 5 here. So we're going to have to make some choices. But I think that once the reference is clear, it really helps in defining what it is that we want to test, and how that could be tested. And so I just wanted to go over this slide briefly and just fly through some of these topics that are emerging for us in our review. Also to give folks an idea of what you might want to comment on or supplement what you've said, now that you see the reference case. So we have here more or less efficiency and electrification in buildings, for example. So that's one theme that we've seen. We've heard comments about what if we max out energy efficiency? What does that get us? Also, what if we achieve less energy efficiency? What if we rely more on alternative fuels for buildings? We've also seen, and we've heard the question a couple times today about what if we constrain vehicle miles traveled? And is that, what would that look like? What if transmission doesn't get built or takes longer than expected? That's a big pivot that we've heard a lot of conversation around. There have been comments about concern over limiting natural gas availability in homes and also in industry, how quickly we can electrify, what some of the barriers are. And so, what would a scenario look like where we don't electrify quite as much and where we rely more on alternative fuels? And then we have, so that's kind of enhanced alternative fuels, and there's also constrained transportation electrification has been one that's come up both for light duty, and in particular, I'd say for medium and heavy duty vehicles. What if load growth is much faster or greater than expected? That's another one we've heard a lot about, just concern over data centers, and the unknowns around that, electrification, growing cooling loads, a lot of unknowns. We've also heard thoughts about a more ambitious decarbonization scenario and whether we want to understand the implications of what that would look like. And there were some comments in the chat relating to that too. And then there have been a number of others. We've heard some comments about more or less offshore wind being built. We had a bit of a discussion today about grid enhancing technologies. So this is really just a warm up to get you all thinking about what you might want to add to what we've heard already. And so, as Jessica said, we're looking for your comments by the end of the day on August 31st. It's a really important deadline for the reference scenario in particular, because we're on a tight timeline to develop an updated proposal to the advisory group. That meeting will be open to anyone to listen in who wants to. We'll be presenting kind of the evolution of what we presented today, what we heard, and what we did with that on September 9th. So that August 31st deadline is really important. I just want to add that if you have thoughts on other scenarios, please share them too. The August 31st is not the deadline for those reflections. We are still working out by when we would need comments on the alternative scenarios, but we really need to lock down the reference and have difficulty locking down the alternative scenarios until we've done that. So stay tuned for that. And I think that pretty much covers it. We will work to get this presentation up online as soon as possible so that folks can refer to it. We've highlighted in orange areas that we're particularly interested for feedback on, but obviously, you can provide feedback on anything. And we really look forward to hearing back from you and appreciate, again, your time and your expertise and your thoughts. So thank you very much.